Alright, welcome back to part 2 of this week's lecture, I guess this topic's lecture, not this week. Dispensing draft beer. I wanted to kind of separate them from packaging beer in kegs to dispensing beer because while they are important to cover in this section of the class, I felt like it was important that we have our own, this section have its own discussion lecture, and I think it's important because this is what it's all about. Dispensing beer, draft beer, that's our moneymaker. So beer is dispensed from a correctly balanced draft system. Some attributes of a balanced system are correct temperature, correct pressure, correct line length and inner diameter, and clean and well maintained. So we'll hit upon some of these attributes that they are all important. There are some that are more important than others. Otherwise, you're just going to be pouring foam. And first thing that we're going to cover that I feel is absolutely the most important thing and probably the most common issue that you'll have with a draft system is temperature. So you'll see in advertising in bars that serve American macro lager, coldest beer in town, or they'll have a beer temperature sign that says 32 degrees. And while that is great for the flavorless American macro lagers, that is not great for craft beer in general. The Brewers Association asserts that the correct dispensing temperature for most draft systems is 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's going to be an average because your refrigerator is going to have peaks and troughs. But you want your average to be around 39. We want that fluid temperature to be as close as possible at 39. If it needs to vary, we would probably be better if it were on a 38, maybe not as high as 42, but we want it close to 39 as possible. So the reason why that is the preferred dispensing temperature is as you get down to 32 degrees, your ability to evaluate and sense flavor is diminished, which is kind of the point with those American macro lagers. They're designed to be as flavorless as possible and to drink as quickly and in mass quantities as possible. They're going to be light, refreshing, and the colder it is, the more refreshing that can seem. So is not the case for most of our craft beers. We want people to taste what we've put into this, and even if we make our own version of an American macro light lager, in my opinion, we're going to have something that is much more flavorful, and I would much prefer it to be served at 39 than at 32. I want the customer to be able to taste what I've put into that beer, what the yeast has contributed. That's my opinion, and the Brewers Association does hold that as well. Pressure, also very important, secondary only to temperature in my opinion. So the pressure required for flow, a correctly balanced system will have about a 1 psi difference of pressure at the faucet for good flow. The higher that pressure difference is, the quicker that beer is going to come out. So if you're pushing maybe a difference of 2 psi, your beer is going to be coming out pretty quickly. And maybe that may be for the case for high flow outdoor taps where you're running a whole lot of beer real fast. Otherwise, that's going to be a little too fast. It's going to be jumping into that glass. It's going to probably be producing some foam. 1 psi difference is a good place to be, and definitely a good place to start. If you want it a little faster, you can adjust upwards. Pressure required to push beer is dependent upon both the temperature and the line diameter and the length of the line. Vertical changes from the center of the keg must also be accounted for during the selection and line design. So the length of the line of your beer draft system can either be determined by the pressure and temperature that you have to have your system at, or can be determined by just your physical restraints. If you can't have shorter line, if you have to have a long draw system, your pressure is going to be much higher. If your system if you want to serve beer at 32, all your beers at 32, your pressure is going to have to be significantly lower because CO2 is going to be much more soluble at 32 than at 39, and you're going to have overcarbonated beer if you're pushing with pressure that will push beer at 39. It's a delicate balance between temperature and pressure. Line length and diameter. So each line material will have a different resistance for each diameter. Most guidelines that are available will get you close to the correct length. You'll see charts that'll show a material and then a firm or a non-varying resistance. And that's just a general guideline in my opinion. Some might take it as the word, but it's not. It's a general guideline, and generally it's going to give you line lengths that are probably a little too short for really what you need. The better indicator is a tool that takes many more factors many more variables into consideration. There's a gentleman, Mike Soltis. He has an online tool that provides a very accurate estimation of proper length. And at 39 degrees and pushing at 12 psi, which is what our system would need to make sure that we have correctly carbonated beer at about 2.5 volumes of CO2, our line length was really closer to 8.5 to 9 feet, somewhere in between there, depending on how quickly you want that beer to flow. While the general guideline resistance is going to say about 6.5 feet. So based on your material, it's going to be a guideline, it's going to be general, and I don't think going by that antiquated, this is the amount of resistance per foot of this tubing, I don't think that's the most accurate way to do it. It's better to start longer and trim as needed rather than start with 6 feet of hose and then realize that, well, this is coming out way too fast, we're having problems. You can't really make your line longer at that point unless you use a jumper, and it's easier just to trim line down to what you need it rather than add line to it or start over. Clean and well maintained. This is where I think some retailers really falter. Brewers Association asserts that beer lines should be cleaned at least every 2 weeks and before a new beer brand is tapped on that line. Every 2 weeks, I wish we could show a show of hands of all the retailers out there that clean their lines every 2 weeks. Now, a lot of times that is going to be left to the distributors to handle that, and then the question becomes, was it done correctly? Was it done appropriately? Were the steps followed 100% of the time? And does the documentation really add up to actually what was done? And that's a lot in that discussion right there. I don't want to say anything bad about any distributors or anything. It's also recommended that the faucets and couplers be disassembled and cleaned on a regular basis. You'll be surprised how many times I've gone to clean a line somewhere, and I'll ask them when they disassembled their faucet, and they say, excuse me? They don't realize that that's something that has to be done. I take that faucet apart and there's just gunk built up inside of it. There's been a couple times where I've just switched out a faucet that I had brought with my little toolbox and brought their faucet back with me and either just replaced it altogether or completely really went to town on it, disassembled it, and made it like new again. Couplers, the same thing. Yeah, they should be disassembled occasionally because as nice as that cleaner is, there are still some nooks and crannies that need to get scrubbed and some gaskets in there that should get scrubbed around as well. You want to just make sure that your system is in the best possible position, you want it to be well maintained. You don't want something in your draft line to detract from your well-crafted beverage. There shouldn't be anything in this line that should detract from the time that you spent, the time and energy that you spent to put into crafting that beer, especially at your location. The best experience a customer is going to have with your beer is through your taps if you have a tap room or a tasting room. So you should maintain the quality of your system better than anybody else's. If somebody goes somewhere and say, man, your beer doesn't taste right at this place, ask the retailer how often they're cleaning, but really you can't control that. All you can control is the quality of your beer in your keg and the quality of your system at your tap room or your tasting room or your facility. Just know the best experience your customer is ever going to have is that through across your countertop. Long draw systems. I recommend against installing a long draw system, but sometimes can't help it. Fact of physical constraints of spaces. We almost had one at my place, and I'm glad we didn't, because it would have just been, it's expensive to install. When you have to replace your lines, you got to replace the whole trunk line, and the trunk lines are expensive. But I digress. Some places it's just a fact. You got to do it. So this is used for beer that is needed to be dispensed 20 feet or more from the place of storage. Long draw systems require higher pressure, so you've got a much farther distance. You either have to have a larger diameter line to have the same pressures that you would do from a short or a direct draw system, or you have to have higher pressure. For a long draw system to have higher pressure, what do we remember from Henry's law? If we have higher pressure on the keg, we're going to have a higher solubility of CO2. We're going to overcarbonate our beer. So the only thing that we can do is use a gas blend to decrease that partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere above that keg while maintaining our desired level of carbonation. So our option is to use beer gas. A standard beer gas is going to be 60-40, or you can get a blender and you have a separate tank of CO2, a separate tank of nitrogen, and you adjust that blender to do a custom blend based on your line length. And that may be necessary depending on how long your draw is. But the line for long draw systems, like I said, is available in trunk sections. And the trunk sections are going to have multiple lines, plus your glycol lines to help keep those lines chilled. So you got your feed line and return line within the same trunk of your glycol to make sure that those lines are well chilled. And there's also going to be insulation wrapped up around these lines to make sure that we don't gain any heat from the atmosphere surrounding this trunk. And something not all long draw systems have, but it is generally recommended, is a Fob system. That's a foam on beer system. What that does is it helps prevent waste of beer by stopping flow once that thing senses foam. Once you push all that remaining liquid out of that keg, you start hitting some foam, that fob will stop the flow and prevent you from pushing 35 feet of foam through your line, and it will prevent a significant amount of waste in your long draw systems. So here we have a cross section of a trunk line featuring 12 draft lines, and we've got 2 feed and 2 return lines. So we've got the color-coded glycol for coming from the glycol machine, and then the red lines returning at the after it loops around and comes back. What this is here is a fair amount of insulation, and then surrounded with tape and binding it all together. What you have there is a great way to dispense beer from 20 feet or longer. That insulation will keep that beer well insulated. That glycol will keep those beer lines nice and cold, and you won't have breakout in this long line. This is the only way to do long draw systems. It is expensive, but you will waste less beer than if you try to do it your own way. Faucets. So we've got our system, we've got our beverage line set up, we're all ready to go. We need the faucet to pour the beer. Open, close. So you got your basic faucet, and it's going to be either chrome-plated brass or stainless steel. I highly recommend stainless steel. It costs a little more, but anytime you can prevent brass touching your beer, I would much prefer stainless steel. There are a couple different designs of faucets. You've got your basic traditional faucet, and it's a rear seal design. The problem with these is that if your faucet doesn't get used very often, so you've got 30 taps, you know, you're pulling this one beer every so often. In between, when you're pulling that beer surrounding that faucet, that seal inside of that faucet is going to get dry and sticky and gunky. So sometimes you're going to have a lot of trouble pulling a tap open that hasn't been used in a while. And that's the issue with the rear sealing designs. The forward seal designs prevents that. That seal is always bathed in fresh beer that's coming from that line. It doesn't dry out, it doesn't get sticky nearly as badly as a rear sealing design. We've got some flow control designs. There is an additional little knob on the side that will add some restriction or remove some restriction. And it allows for a little bit of a finer control and that last little bit of resistance on your line. If you have some beers maybe that, let's say your system like ours has one regulator or two regulators feeding all of your lines, you really have to have all the beers at the same carbonation level, otherwise you're going to have issues. Sometimes your carbonation levels are going to vary slightly. That flow control allows for a little fine differences in the difference between the carbonation levels of beers. And then you've got side pull, and those are going to be for like slow pour, check pills type stuff, fun. Not something you typically see, but they're fun, they're great if you know how to use them. So we can see here examples of these. This is your basic traditional faucet. This is your basic forward seal design. And this is your flow control design there with that little knob on the side. And this is your side pull. And it also has a creamer function on this one as well to get you that pillow of head on those check beers, check pills and check dark lagers, things like that. Depending on, obviously the price increases as you go here. These are going to be the cheapest option. Those are going to come default if you order things online that come with a faucet. It is almost always going to be your basic chrome-plated brass. I highly recommend at least going with the forward seal design. That way you're not yanking through sticky beer the whole time. Because if you have a number of taps, there are going to be some taps that get used significantly less often than others. And like I said, we have the flow control design that does allow that last little bit of resistance difference. I don't have any of these. I have seen people use them. Depending on the style, if you've got a check pills and you want to have a slow pour pills, that's your way to do it right there. The traditional way, at least. Excuse me. Cleaning lines. So we want to have a well-balanced, maintained, clean system. How do we clean lines? Like I said, the Brewers Association is going to say clean your lines at least every 2 weeks and between brand changes. You don't have to clean your lines between every keg. If it's the same beer brand, it does not matter. If you're running through a bunch of kegs, you don't clean the line. You just put your new keg on and move on. But you're going to clean it every 2 weeks no matter what. But let's say you've got the last keg of an Imperial Stout, it kicks, and what's coming on next is a Pilsner. Do not run that Pilsner through that Stout line. Clean your line between brands, or else your Pilsner is going to taste like a roasty, a little hint of roast. And the same goes with spiced beers. Spiced beers are a little problematic. The spices like to hang out in the line. So you definitely want to change, when you change, you definitely want to clean your line between brands as far as spice stuff goes, and you definitely want to let that cleaner linger if you're using the static method, or let it run a little longer if you're using the continuous loop. So the chemicals that we're going to use are alkaline based or acid based. The alkaline is a beer line cleaner. Micromatic has their own brand. Acid based, acid line cleaner. Micromatic has their own brand as well. So with using those chemicals, we have two methods. Continuous recirculation, so that uses a pump and it just like it is. It's continuous recirculation through that line. And what it does is allows for a turbulent flow to go through that line, and that acts as a scrubbing action against that line and cleans that line. And we also have the static method for places that don't have a pump and don't have the resources to buy all of the jumpers and all of the K coupler bridges and everything. Static takes more time. It can be just as effective. It just takes more time. So continuous recirculation, like I said, it requires a pump and a coupler and faucet bridges. So if you're cleaning more than one line at a time, you're at the top. When you pull your faucets, you're going to need a jumper to go from faucet to faucet. And then underneath, you're going to need a bridge to go from coupler to coupler. And then that last one is going to return to your reservoir, which can be just as simple as a bucket with a submersible pump inside. So most effective method, because it is constant recirculating, there is some turbulent flow within that line, it is going to be the most effective line. It requires the least amount of time. But probably still going to take you 15 to 20 minutes of recirculation, depending on what was in that line before. Static, very common. I would say a lot of breweries that don't have a pump or anything like that, they're going to be running static. We do. I haven't bothered to buy a pump or all the jumpers and everything. Requires a vessel for pressurization, so you need a little, they are sold a 1 gallon, one gallon or 2 gallon, you can buy them in different sizes, a little plastic keg basically. Pressurize it, and then you just, like you're dispensing beer out of it. Unscrews at the top, put your chemical in, put your water to dilute the chemical, and run it through your line. Run it until you stop seeing beer colored liquid come out, close your line, and then you let that sit for at least 20 minutes. Ideally, I would let it go for 30 minutes. The most important thing to make this static method work is time. It takes time because you don't have that liquid running past there constantly with turbulent flow. It's just sitting there dissolving. So you want to make sure that you give it plenty of time to do its job. Hook it up, run your cleaner through it until beer stops coming out. Set a timer for 25-30 minutes, go do something else. Or if you're cleaning multiple lines, hook it up, let it run, unhook it, move to the next one, hook it up, let it run, unmove it, and at the end of the last one, depending on how long it's taking you to get to that last one, set a timer at the end of the last one. It's going to take longer. I mean, that first tap that you did is obviously going to be sitting longer than the rest of them, but if you let that go for the last line you hooked up to long enough for that one to go, to be clean, the other ones are definitely going to be clean. And then come through, change your chemical out for rinse water, open them up, clean out, let your rinse water run until you know for sure that you're no longer running chemical through. Best way to do that is to test it with a pH indicator solution. If you're running alkaline cleaner, phenolphthalein, when it is in alkaline, it's got a pink. Once it gets to around neutral, it starts to just look like water. It doesn't have a color when you get to neutral pH. Very cheap method of guaranteeing that you no longer have chemical in your line. Main chemical used is alkaline based. If that is what you choose to use for most of your cleaning, you should run some acid occasionally, maybe every couple months or so, in your lines to make sure that you're assisting in that clearing of beer stone, that calcium oxalate. That acid will help clear up any potential buildup of that in your lines. So then we get to mobile or remote pouring. So this would be at festivals or beer fests or just remote locations where you're set up and you're running beer that's not through your kegerator or any other tap line in your tap room. One of the more common methods of doing this is with a jockey box. That's a cooler that has coils or a plate heat exchanger inside and filled with ice. Like I said, you have either a coil method or a plate heat exchanger method. Both are going to be just fine. The longer your coils are, the cooler and more effective at cooling your beer is. The plate heat exchanger is very effective. There are also glycol chilled draft carts. Works in a very similar idea, method as the jockey box, but it's kind of all contained within a little cart area. There's a glycol bath that the beer runs through. There's usually stainless lines inside of that glycol bath, and a refrigeration system maintains the temperature of that glycol bath. Sometimes those require CO2 pumps. It all depends on the design itself, but having that glycol bath is a more consistent cooling temperature than just ice water bath. We have draft trailers. Basically, it's just a refrigerated trailer with a hole drilled through the side through which your draft line goes. Can't think of the word right now. And then the worst idea anybody could ever possibly have is a hand pump. Don't use a hand pump for your beer. Very quickly the beer becomes oxidized. And I understand that you're not going to have control over if you sell a keg to somebody and they go out and have a party and they're hand pumping it. You can discourage it, but you're making a sale. You can't really control what the customer does with it at that point. But if it is you serving your beer at a remote location, do not ever use a hand pump. Just no. I don't know what else to say. Don't. Keg storage. During these, you'll want to try to make sure that your kegs are cold, whether it be a tub or just a container of some sort in which you can place ice and water to keep that liquid cold. Don't forget that the beer is going to be coming from the bottom of the keg first, so at least if the bottom of your keg is submerged in ice water, that's going to help prevent foamy pouring through your jockey box or through whatever you're pouring. I've found that a tall kitchen trash can fits a sixtel with plenty of room for ice perfectly, and it's not overly big, unwieldy. It's very easy to move about, even with the keg and ice inside of it. Works really well for sixtels. Half barrels, big trash bag, or big trash can, a 32-gallon size, or a big tub with the ropes on the sides. Just as long as you can get them in some ice water, keep that beer as cool as possible, especially if it's hot outside. If it's cold outside, it's not that big a deal. Your kegs can be sitting out. If it's in the 30s or 40s, it's not that big a deal. You're going to run in through some ice anyway. So, if it's hot, ice. And we can see here some examples of the coil jockey box and the plate heat exchanger. Obviously, the plate heat exchanger does not take up nearly as much room. You can use significantly less ice with the plate heat exchanger, and also use the cooler with the plate heat exchanger more as coolers for soft drinks, things like that. And this one, there's not nearly as much room just because of the way the design of the coils are. You can still put some drinks in top there, but it's not going to hold nearly as much as the plate chiller. The plate chillers just don't take up nearly as much room. You can see here, draft trailer set up under a tent. You can see the trailer with the taps coming right through the side there. So the most important thing that you need to know how to do is to troubleshoot a draft system. Somebody calls you and say, we're pouring foam. You need to know how to fix it. You need to know what questions to ask of that person to figure out maybe what the problem is. And most common issue that's going to be is temperature. It's almost always going to be a temperature issue. First question you should ask, if somebody tells you, hey, we're pouring foam, what do we need to do? Verify the temperature of the kegerator, make sure that your refrigeration system is working. Temperature, that's your most common problem. Either the kegs were allowed to come up to well above serving temperature, either through storage or transit, and haven't been allowed enough time to come down to serving temperature. It takes a lot longer to chill a keg down to serving temperature than it does for it to warm up. It's silly, it sucks, but it takes a while. If you get kegs that have warmed up during transit, if you're buying kegs from through a distributor from another brewery, don't put it on within 24 hours. Let it sit in your cooler for 24 hours at least. Temperature. So if you're not pouring at all, someone opened the faucet and just a single drip comes out, there's nothing. Turn on the gas. Check to make sure that coupler is actually engaged in your keg. That happens sometimes. If keg gets bumped when you're switching kegs out, sometimes that handle will come disengaged. So the first question that you might ask a bartender is say, hey, I pulled the faucet on this beer and nothing's coming out. Check to see if that handle got knocked, bumped, or disengaged of some sort. If it's up, re-engage it and it should pour. If that's not the case, then likely if you have independent control of each line from a regulator, the gas may have gotten turned off. Check to make sure that all your ball valves are open on your gas distribution system. If all your valves are open, your keg is engaged, all your valves are open on your gas, check to see if you have pressure in your CO2 system. If your regulator's reading 0, you've had a gas leak and you've leaked out all of your gas. Not great. And it's not as simple as just switching out the tank and hooking it up. You need to figure out why you leaked out all your gas, otherwise you're going to leak out all the gas in that next tank. So hook up your gas and figure out where your leak's coming from before you leave. So next problem, beer is pouring too quickly and it's creating foam. So we're going to turn down the pressure because likely somehow the keg got overpressurized. Either somebody turned the regulator when they shouldn't have. Another thing maybe you should let your bartenders know, if they don't know what they're doing, they should not be turning a regulator. If you haven't taught them how to handle your draft system, they should not be turning a regulator. So it's coming out too quickly. We're going to check your regulator, see what it's running. If it's not at the right pressure that is needed to dispense your beer, correct that, drain the pressure off your keg by pulling the pressure release valve and allow it to repressurize at the correct pressure and see if that helps, see if that corrects your problem. And if that's not the issue, then maybe your lines are just too short by design. Replace your lines with longer lines if none of those troubleshooting steps work, and likely your issue is going to be resolved. Beer pouring too slowly. So that could be from just an underpressurized system. Maybe your regulator got turned down and nobody realized it. Don't touch the regulator if you don't know what you're doing. Maybe put a sign on it that says, do you know what you're doing? Then don't touch. If everything's appropriate, all of your pressures are correct, and it might just be that maybe your line's a little too long. Trim your line and go from there. All right, thank you.